I made some art. It's also magnetic.
If you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen me driving around town acting like a crazy person, picking up logs and sticks after a storm. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but then I got invited to be part of a wall art challenge. There were two parameters that they gave. They said it needed to be made out of wood and it needed to be square. So they said square, I thought circle. So I'm going to be cutting this into cookies and creating some sort of wall art with it. I'm going to link down below to all the other videos and all the other links to the other pages for the people who are involved in this challenge. It is really cool to see how creative people are. There were just two rules that we needed to follow and everyone made such different projects. Definitely go check all those out. There's a playlist to all the videos for the people who made videos. I definitely recommend watching them. So let's get started. I had a goal for this project to not spend any extra money and just use what I have on hand, and I broke that right off the bat by buying a can of black spray paint. Cutting round objects with power tools is really tricky. The miter saw didn't feel so safe. I thought maybe my crosscut sled would be good, but then this happened. So I needed to find a safe way to do that. So I came up with this little jig. I didn't record myself building it, but I'll just show you guys what I did. It's 1/4 inch plywood so that it takes up the least amount of space. I don't really have a lot of space to work with on this bandsaw. So I wanted to use the smallest amount of material as possible for the bottom. And then I took this plywood scraps and I put a 45-degree cut on each one of the ends. And I have these supports that are just little triangles cut out of some scraps as well. And this is all glued and nailed into place. I was considering at first making one of them adjustable, that it could move to cut wider logs, but because this bandsaw only really has a 3.5, 3.25 inch capacity, there really isn't much room for adjustment. So if you have a larger bandsaw, it would be a really cool idea to create something larger than this. And I was thinking about doing dowels, so you could like put it in the dowels and adjust for the different size logs. So I don't even know if this is going to work, so let's see if it works. Another thing to note about the jig was that I offset the support so that I could lower the blade guard to the correct height for the logs. And let's see if it works. And it was a success. It felt safe to me and I liked the results. But then I realized it would be really helpful if I put some sort of stop on the end of it. So I drilled a hole and put a dowel in, and this way I can make repeatable cuts and have them the same thickness. So I just kept continuing cutting along. It was tedious, but it was fine. And what's really cool, I found this piece, what I think is poplar, only from like the rainbowy color, but you could see here it holds the bigger logs just as well. And then it was time to bake the cookies. Yes, bake them. Some of these logs were green, so they were a little bit wet. And I put them in the oven at a low temperature, flipping them every 15 minutes or so. And the correct way to do this is to actually weigh them. I didn't do that, but I think it was good enough. After the cookies cooled, I drilled holes for the magnets. I tested to see if it was a good depth that the magnet would stick, and it was good, so I kept drilling along. I decided to only put magnets on the bigger cookies just so that I would know where the magnets were on the board. And for anyone who placed a bet on Instagram, the tower fell. So expect a check soon, maybe. So now it was actually time to put the magnets in the cookies. I wanted to make sure that the magnets were all facing in the same direction. So I took another magnet and I marked on the side where the magnet stuck. And then I used CA glue with an accelerator spray on the other side of the magnet and held it in place, and it was perfect. So I continued gluing them all in, just using the CA glue and then the accelerator spray and then holding it down for like 3 seconds. And then after all the magnets were in, I went back with the CA glue and put like another layer on top just so that it secured it into place. While my helper was sanding all the cookies, I got to working on the frames. So I didn't want to spend any money on this, so I used leftovers from the maple entryway table that I built. I cleaned up all the sides and then split them up to create 4 equal pieces. I also chose maple because I thought some of the cookies were maple, but you'll see when I put the finish on, they're not maple. Anyway, I cleaned up the frames on my router table that I use as a jointer, and then I got to cutting all the miters. I use this miter jig for my crosscut sled. I just added a little back piece for my last video. The back piece just helps me clamp it onto the sled so it stays in place so I could get to cutting the miters. I'm really enjoying using this miter jig for the sled. Let me show you guys how perfect that miter is. I'm just loving it. So I continued to cut the miters on one end of each of the boards. And then after I had one miter on one side, I lined them up onto my frame and I marked off where I should cut the boards on the other side. I took them over to the miter saw. I don't know why I didn't just use my crosscut sled. And then I used the miter jig again to cut the other miters, and I had a perfect frame. My original plan for this frame was to put a rabbit around all the sides to create a little lip for the plywood to sit on, but something went awry with my measurements and I needed to figure out something else. So I took this scrap piece of pine and I created kind of like a little shelf for the plywood to sit on. I put in some pocket holes and then glued and screwed them to the maple boards. Even though this wasn't originally how I intended the frame to be, it actually worked out quite well. There was a lot of surface area for the plywood to sit on. So I did that to all four sides and then got to gluing it up. I used one of these like frame clamps. I find these really handy in these situations. I put the plywood in just to make sure that it was square, but I didn't glue it yet into place. After the glue dried, I sanded all parts of the frame and then got to gluing the plywood in. I figured that I didn't need to reinforce the miters since the plywood was going to be kind of like locking it all into place sitting on these supports. I don't know, comment below if I'm wrong. So I clamped it down and then I used my favorite tool, the brad nailer, to lock it all into place so that I could continue working. To prepare the frame for the epoxy pour, I took some of the CA glue and I went around all of the edges of the frames to make sure that any gaps were closed up so that the epoxy wouldn't leak through the bottom of the frame. Then I got to placing the cookies. I really wanted the pattern to be random, so I tried not to put any thought into it, and once I put it down, it went down. I didn't move it. I almost got a perfect amount of cookies. There were 2 left over, which I was kind of really impressed that I got it pretty close. Now I needed to prepare the cookies for the epoxy pour. So I needed to temporarily hold them in place. So I used the CA glue with the accelerator spray again, and I went piece by piece, spraying each piece down. This glue is not there to hold it there permanently. It's really just there to hold it while I pour the epoxy so that the pieces don't float up in the pour. Tedious, yes, but it worked really well. So I only decided to do an epoxy pour because this company had sent it to me and I wanted to try it out, and I'm kind of regretting it. I'm not sure that I like the way that it looks. The pieces got really dark and I didn't like how they looked underneath the epoxy. So after it dried, I sanded back all the pieces that were sticking up high, and then I finished them with shellac, which I think was a nicer finish. But now you can see that it's not actually maple, those pieces that I thought were maple. Anyway, since I knew my kids were going to be using this a lot, putting magnets on it, I decided to make it really strong. So I used a French cleat system to put it into the wall. If I would have thought of this beforehand, I would have made those pine borders into a French cleat so I didn't have to add one at the end. See how it's just a cut on a 45 and it fits right into it. Super easy, just screw one piece onto your frame and screw one piece into the wall. So I made some measurements from where I wanted the frame to go and marked off the center of the wall as well. And then I screwed into a stud. Then I took a huge level and leveled it off. I know I need to get a smaller level for these applications. And then I locked down that center screw that was in the stud and then put 2 more screws on either side. Did the pull test and then it's done. You just put your frame up and it's complete. Super simple way to hang something up. And the last thing to do is to test it out with a magnet. Done.
And there you have it, it's complete. I have to be a little bit honest with you guys. I'm not really loving it so much. I thought that this was maple and it's not. That's why I made the maple frame. So I thought it was going to be lighter. I believe it might be ash. So it's a little bit darker than what I had imagined it was going to be. And I don't love how the epoxy looks also. It looked better to me before I poured the epoxy, but it's going to be covered up by my children's artwork anyway, so it's still going to be functional and I'm still going to enjoy it. So thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.
Oh yeah, and don't forget to check out the playlist below to see all the other videos for this wall art challenge. It's really cool to see how everyone comes up with different projects. All right, see you on the next one.